Okay, so hello everybody and thank you for joining us today. Today we're joined by Chris Radband from NetIQ and Matt Gallick here from Byte Software Services, and we'll be presenting a webinar on Active Directory with NetIQ. So just before the webinar itself, just a couple of housekeeping details for you. During the webinar you are all muted, but if you do have any questions at any point, then please do submit them into the questions box which is on the right hand side of your screen. There will be a Q&A session at the end, so any of those questions that you do ask will be answered at the end, and if there are any questions that we do need to take offline, then obviously we will get in touch with you afterwards and follow those up with you. The webinar is recorded, so we will send you out a copy of that afterwards in an email so that you can obviously share that with anybody else that you may think it could be relevant to as well. And you'll also notice at the end of the webinar there'll be a critique form, so we do appreciate any feedback that you can give us, and that will also give you the opportunity there to request a call back from us. So if there is anything that you do see within the webinar at any point that you would like further details on, please do let us know there, and we can obviously make sure that we get back in touch with you and follow up on those as well. So I'm now going to hand over to Matt Gallick.
Hi all. Again, thank you very much for joining us and taking the time out of your day. Hopefully today will be useful for you. As advertised, we're hoping to give you a good idea of how you can clean up your AD and keep it managed moving forward as best possible. Just wanted to take a couple of minutes to let you know that we brought NetIQ into Bytes as a strategic vendor. The reason we brought it in was because we've seen quite a lot of issues with AD within our customer base, and the concerns they have are all quite similar. And luckily NetIQ is extremely good at combating these issues. And as per the slide, the feedback we've had from customers we've talked to about it so far have been absolutely overwhelming. We hope you guys see the same benefits, and as Sarah said, ask any questions you like as we go through, and if you want any follow-ups, further demos, proof of concepts, etc., or just any general questions, then let us know. We'll be more than happy to follow up whatever you need. I'm now going to pass over to Chris, who will take us through the WebEx. Thank you. Over to you, Chris.
Welcome to this WebEx called Scrubbing Your Active Directory Squeaky Clean. My name's Chris Radband and I'm a Senior Solutions Consultant for NetIQ. Got around 15 years experience in the industry as a domain admin, as a professional services consultant, and as a pre-sales engineer around the identity and security market. NetIQ and their technologies have been in the AD management space for over 15 years as well, with a strong pedigree with mature solutions which are highly recommended by the analysts. So let's look at who's on the call today. We've got a diverse set of audience on the call with all sorts of job titles from all sorts of industries. Primarily because Active Directory in the health and maintenance is applicable to all industries, and the challenges we see are common across all sectors. We're going to look at four primary areas today, because having been in the industry for such a long time, visiting many different customers throughout the industries, each with differing environments, I see common challenges. We'll look at challenges and possible solutions in four key areas, starting with how a mature and uncluttered Active Directory can be cleaned up. We'll then review common challenges around things like compliance and audit, how we can proactively control these challenges, and then look at handing some power back to the end user or indeed their manager. Ideally, let's work towards turning good practice into standard practice. So I like to start with a cleanup at the beginning, because in reality few people are lucky enough to have a greenfield site, so it's handy to be able to get these things tidy before moving forwards, to allow you to actually understand what you have. In reality though, in an operational environment, it's important to recognise that cleanup tends to go hand in hand with day-to-day business. So whilst it would be nice to have that greenfield site or to have a perfectly clean environment, recognise the need for it to be automated or practical and done in a staged fashion. Ideally, the purpose is to give you a good base from which to work from. When I show this slide to people, there are usually lots of nods and comments of acknowledgement, because it's really a client for whom at least some of these challenges don't ring true. So if we look at some of the key challenges there, what's the biggest risk? So the biggest risk there is around power users. Commonly, those power user groups, for example, actually are in nested groups. So you'll see that not only have those users got significant rights and permissions over the directory and its management, but also that nested groups exist there for further administrative users, making it quite difficult to manage. These are critical groups. There's a recognition that there's a need to reduce the number of those users and delegate appropriate permissions instead to them. On the other hand, let's look at common audit failing. So, for example, excessive inactive but enabled users. It's a challenge that a lot of companies have because there's a poor communication or a manual communication or paper-based between HR and IT. So at some point, as an IT organisation, you may be notified of that user having left or that user not even having started in the first place. But commonly, the IT aren't notified that users have left the organisation. There's a risk there because obviously what that means is that enabled user accounts, potentially with significant permissions, are active and enabled for logon. It's a recognised statistic that around 50% of data breaches are commonly blamed upon the accounts of users which are no longer with the organisation. And finally, let's look at a bad practice here. Very common, but bad practice nevertheless. Password set never to expire, for example. Sometimes it's a necessary evil with things like service accounts, but it's important to minimize these accounts and to recognize them so that they can be secured both from a proactive monitoring point of view, but also from a increased security level for the password, more complexity, and perhaps regular changes where possible, so even perhaps annually rather than default 90 days, for example. These illustrate just a few of the common security, performance and audit risks that we see, but they illustrate very well examples across industries because they're common throughout all Active Directories. I see many customers where scripting is a standard solution to the challenges that we've been looking at because they find it difficult or even daunting to find another solution which is effective and can clean up safely. Scripting presents a number of risks. Not only are they commonly labour intensive, but unproven scripts, for example, have a severe level of potential risk. For example, I saw a customer recently who had accidentally emptied their domain admins group by running a group cleanup task. The script was unknown and certainly had significant impact for them. Also, there are risks around things like knowledge flight, whereby you may have one really great scripting guy who's been with the organisation and generated lots of custom scripts, but if that user leaves or is unable to work for whatever reason, and that expertise disappears, there's no process around that to be able to manage the scripts, and then another level of risk is implemented. So, as we said, labour intensive, generally limited functionality, very basic functionality, inaccurate potentially, and with that risk of unexpected results. So whilst I see many customers using scripts like this, let's consider an automated process designed uniquely around your business requirements and defined by your stakeholders. So for example, if we were doing an AD cleanup, a user cleanup task, you may consider that your organisation may define that an inactive user is one which hasn't been active for 30 days. You may say that the people required to approve a change to an account, you may say that those are the user's manager, you may equally say they're HR. The key thing is that it's around your corporate requirements. So there is a better world of automation, out-of-the-box functionality, without risks and challenges of scripts like we've just looked at. So for example, consider a fully tested solution with supported workflow solutions designed around ITIL methodology for testing and retesting and documentation, reproducible tasks, and customizable, as I said, to your specific requirements. So look at where we've come from. An unmanaged, risky script with significant potential impacts to safe, reliable, automatable processes. There's definitely a better way. So let's take a look at this specific example. 3 steps really. Firstly, a discovery stage. So we know what the challenge is. It's around defining inactive accounts. So the discovery is basically a process running to determine which accounts are inactive. And in the organization here, we've defined that is accounts which have not accessed for 30 days. We can then look at the action required. So an administrator or manager, subject to your requirements, can disable the account. So they'll simply approve that via email or any other process of your choice. They can approve that disabling, and then the remediation step can be around actual automatic disabling of that account. So there's been no need for IT to get involved, to run scripts or any other process to generate a report. The onus has been put onto the manager of the user to define whether the user should be disabled, and then automatically the user is disabled. You may, as IT, like try to step in to check that you're happy for the user to be disabled, but the general process of discovery, action and remediation flows very nicely. Let's move on. So now that we've tidied up, or at least understood the challenge so that we can tidy up moving forwards, let's look at common and current challenges in our experience. So what are these challenges, and how can we ensure that they don't bring the environment into a poor state, back into the mess that potentially it was before the cleanup was run? We'll look at a couple of common examples I've seen, first around audit and compliance, and then around group policy management. There are many standards, Sarbanes-Oxley, HIPAA, PCI DSS. Many of those standards have elements of good practice in them. Many regulatory frameworks dictate that processes and procedures should be in place to control, monitor and report on security-related activities of the organisation. So let's take an example of ISO 27001. It says that care should be taken that no single person can access, modify or use assets without authorization or detection. But natively, ensuring this is very difficult. Trawling event logs isn't realistic, it's time consuming, logs often roll over before you get to them. And let's consider that even if you do have the will and the manpower to do this manually, how do you report upon this? There's certainly no ease of use, and often compliance mandates won't accept that manual process. So there's a need to be proactive and immediate in your response. For example, if a security exploit is recognized 2 weeks late, it's more than likely too late to resolve the issue. You may be able to do something about it moving forwards, but if it's too late, the problems are already existing. The reality of compliance as well is that for some standards such as Sarbanes-Oxley, someone could go to jail. So let's consider again the better world. Let's consider audit solutions, and let's consider in this case what people generally want from those solutions. So generally the reason for purchase is for a tick in the box. That solves or helps with anyway the regulation and compliance requirements. But on top of that, what's actually going on in my environment? Let's start to look at best practice while we're doing these compliance requirements. And let's also look at real-time alerting for crucial high security tasks and changes that have been made. Sometimes a weekly report is perfect, sometimes a weekly report is far too late for suspicious changes that may occur. For example, I saw a company recently where they implemented an audit solution like this, and within a couple of hours of the audit solution being put in place, they could see one of their help desk guys who had domain admin permissions because the delegation model wasn't sufficient, was trying to put in place his colleague, his friend, who was just a normal administrator, not an IT administrator. He was trying to put that user into domain admins. Now, thankfully, he didn't have sufficient permissions to do that, but he potentially shouldn't have been even able to access that case in the first place. So consider the opportunity cost and the risk that you're potentially accepting by not proactively monitoring the Active Directory. Potential failed audit, negative media coverage, or even downtime. So if that user had managed to add his friend into domain admins, the repercussions could have been significant. So proactive rather than reactive monitoring, absolutely crucial. Let's consider a second example. I saw this at an insurance company. They'd rolled out a group policy to publish a new shortcut for the desktop. What they'd actually done was removed all shortcuts from the desktop, and they had no group policy backup or rollback available to them. It took over an hour to troubleshoot and update the group policy, and then another hour for all users to restart once the group policy had been corrected and implemented. So if we calculate that around 1,500 users on a Monday morning with no access to their computers for almost 2 hours per person, that's around 3,000 hours unable to service customers and complete downtime for the user base. So as an organisation, they recognised, obviously, having learned the hard way, that their current group policy practice wasn't working for them. And unfortunately, they'd learned the hard way. So they came to us for help, requesting 4 key pieces: version control, notification, alerting, and rollback. And so we proposed to them a complete automated solution so that on top of those 4 required pieces, there'd be additional functionality so that managed and unmanaged group policies would be brought into the management control. So what that means is that those which went through the correct group policy management process would be managed, but also those which were perhaps done outside of process, instead of going around the houses, so to speak, those would also be secured and have rollback, notification, and so on in place. So let's look at a process which we put in place for them. 3 steps once again, really. Firstly, is around discovery and identification, in this case, of the change. So detecting an unmanaged group policy change. What happens then is that an email is directly sent to the appropriate people, whether that be the manager, IT owners, whoever may be appropriate and whoever is defined by yourselves, offering them a decision and giving them information they need to make that decision. So they have group policy change information, they have the time, they have the details, they have the event that actually occurred. So the email text, very clearly there, it's been an unauthorized GPO change. If you want to roll back, reply with rollback in this email. So very straightforward, could be done on a mobile device, could be done on a BlackBerry, any device that you can manage email on, you could respond and roll back this potentially harmful change. So this is just an example, but this is a real-time proactive management of group policies which not only adhere to good practice but also minimises the loss, the potential loss of revenue and the impact recurring as they've already faced. So there are a couple of common challenges that we tend to see in the market. Group policy management, it can be a nightmare potentially, and also around compliance and audit requirements. Let's move on to the next step though. We've looked at the mature Active Directory and how we clean it up. We've looked at those challenges, and now I want to look at how we can regain control over the directory, continuing with the theme of turning good practice into standard practice. So let's consider managing permissions for both privileged and non-privileged users. We've looked at auditing and alerting, but let's consider being proactive with our delegation model. For example, if we look at managing privileged users, natively It's very difficult indeed to securely and granularly delegate those permissions. It's near impossible to report upon those delegated permissions, and natively everyone, even average users, have read permissions of the directory. So wouldn't it be great if you could have a role-based model which really manages the who, the what and the where challenges, with wrapped around that the added value of complete auditing? So consider an example of a help desk. So the who may be an Active Directory group of help desk users. In reality, it's quite common that those Active Directory users and those help desk operators quite commonly have domain admin permissions. Excessive, without a doubt, but because it's such a challenge to manage those permissions, it's a very common issue that we come across. So take those users and then let's consider what the functionality and permissions that they should have. Commonly, although defined by yourselves, commonly they should have probably something along the lines of password reset permissions, group membership management, and not much else. And then if we look at the where side of things, we can consider that perhaps the help desk people should only be managing basic users and basic groups. They certainly shouldn't have permission over things like domain admins, VIPs, users and objects like that. So if we bring that together and say that with this concept, the help desk have minimum permissions over the minimum object set. So you're limiting their capabilities by what they can see and what they can do. Much more appropriate delegation of permissions and way for the help desk team to manage objects. I've seen many examples of this, of the delegation models. One implemented because there was a recognition that the domain admins had too many permissions. The example here is where one of the domain admins was using their rights to view financial information and payroll information, not required for their role, but they were doing that inappropriately. So implementing a delegation model ensured that the administrator could perform their daily task, but couldn't do things and perform tasks that were inappropriate. Comparatively, I've seen scenarios where administrators, group leaders or managers have been empowered to do some basic administration and management over their team. A perfect example of this is allowing a manager to manage their team's passwords. So rather than calling the help desk or any potential delays there, there's no reason that a manager couldn't reset the password of one of his team members. So this is all around reducing security challenges whilst improving good practice and potentially audit results. Let's move on though to consider how we can further empower the user with things like just-in-time automated processes for, in this case, automated group membership, but there's no reason that you couldn't do it for user provisioning, deprovisioning, temporary group membership, anything along those lines. So the user here may be the end user, it may be a manager. The important point to note is it's taking the workload away from IT, so that help desk once again can go and concentrate on other tasks rather than processes that run over and over again and are perfect candidates for automation. So we can see here that for a temporary access request, a user would select the group they need to be a member of, give a business purpose, and then define when the permission should start and if it should expire. Perfect, for example, for a change control to be done on a weekend where a user requires significant permissions but only short term. So step one there is for them to complete that form. If we then look at step two, an automated process would automatically have discovered what the group was and all the details of it. And the first time that anybody else needs to get involved is when a decision needs to be made. Now that's probably going to be made by the business owner, the group owner. Is the approval accepted, approved or denied? Assuming that it's an approval, we can then move forwards the user is added to the group at the appropriate time, and then importantly also removed from the group at the appropriate time. So after the 2 hours of the change control window, perhaps the user is removed from the group. You may like to add in a step to notify the user that they're going to be removed from the group, would they like to extend. But it's a very important security consideration to remove that user from the group, because it's a very common challenge that customers see where they get permissions creep by every time they perform a task or change job role, for example, they will get additional permissions, but they'll never have them taken away. So if you look at a user, for example, that's moved around an organization after several years, they are more than likely to have permissions way in excess of what's appropriate for their job. Obviously that becomes a security risk. So let's look at, we've touched on user provisioning, could be done in just-in-time fashion, just the same as we've just seen with group management, but also challenges like deprovisioning. It's often overlooked and it's a significant security challenge. Around 44% of organizations experience security breaches, blame that upon the accounts associated with ex-employees. So consider how in a process and automated fashion, as we've been looking at, how you could not only potentially disable an account, but also move it, rename it, delegate access perhaps to the mailbox or home folder, and even potentially manage physical access to the systems. So you may have a system connected to the directory which allows you to enable or disable physical door access cards to ensure that the end user, once deprovisioned, is completely secure and can't come back into the environment either physically or from an access point of view into the directory. So let's move on to the final step of empowering the end user rather than just the manager perhaps. So we've looked at cleanup of a mature Active Directory and we've looked at challenges and so on. And we've looked at how we can begin to turn good practice into standard practice, but I'd like to give some power to the end user. First of all, we'll look at some statistics quickly, and we'll then consider how we can manage that. So take a look at this. So 3/4 of intrusions exploit weak or stolen credentials. 4/5 of people admit to having forgotten a password, and around 2/3 of people use the same password for multiple accounts and also potentially write the passwords down. So that becomes obviously a security risk. So instead of users feeling they have to write passwords down or use common passwords because they'll forget them, let's provide the user an ability to reset and manage that password from anywhere and at any time. So a web-based system, for example, or Control-Alt-Delete screen system, for example, where the user can manage their own passwords, it increases security, obviously, because they're less likely to write down passwords, less likely to go through the challenges of reusing the passwords elsewhere, and also it allows you potentially to increase password complexity policies, so that increases the security of the organization as well as the end user. Obviously, there's also impacts around help desk expense as well, because they're freed up to perform high-value tasks. It's not uncommon to estimate that in many organizations, help desk calls for password-related challenges can be up to 3/4. It's an age-old problem with a solution. So that solution means that you can very quickly calculate the ROI and deliver a solution very efficiently, both for the end users and financially and for help desk productivity. As well as servicing self-service password reset functionality, let's consider further service functionality to empower the business users even more. For example, group membership management or basic delegated account changes. You may consider allowing users in perhaps a BYOD environment. You may consider allowing them to manage their phone number, for example, because as a mobile phone number, that user does know best. So you may allow them to manage certain attributes which aren't critical to the organization, but for which they know best. That further reduces help desk calls, allowing them to focus elsewhere, and once again illustrates additional return on investment. So before I show you a quick demo of an administrative group membership process, I just wanted to mention some of our NetIQ solutions which help organisations like yours with the challenges that we've discussed today. We've been in the market a long time and have helped resolve many diverse challenges. This is precisely why we're working with Bytes. So if you go to netiq.com, products, you'll be able to find more information on all of these, read upon it, and obviously you can speak to Bytes for further information. So what you can see here is my lab. I want to show you a very quick process just around temporary admin group membership. So I'm going to open the process and start the process. What you see here is me manually running the process, but you could just as easily start the process from an email trigger or from a web form. Equally, from a SQL database, table being updated, anything along those lines. The key thing is that where the collect input from user is prompted, that information is supplied to the process. So I'm manually inputting this information, and I can see that at 6:30 on the 30th, I'm requesting access for 3 hours based upon a specific change request, for example. I can then see that the process then goes through, it takes the object properties, emails the group owner in this case. As we said, the processes can be defined to your heart's content so that you could have the HR and IT administrator, anybody could be the approver, but in this case we've got the group owner. The process is now waiting for a response. We'll wait a short time, or as defined by your process, it may escalate to other people if there's no response in time. But if we assume that the approval has been generated, the next step is that the process will wait until 6:30 on the specified date. It will then add the member to the group. It will wait, in this case, 3 hours. And then at the end of that period, it will remove the member from the group again. Once removed, the workflow will end. So we can see there that the user has requested the access, gone through an approval process, being added to the group when required, not when approval was sought, so that we can ensure the group membership is in a minimum time required, and then secured again at the end of the process when the workflow ends, completely audited, completely defined to your processes, and all visual and very easy to manage.